The following was originally aired on Moody Radio Cleveland.
All right, buckle up. Here we go.
Mm-hmm.
My very favorite, one of my very favorites, I should say, because I don't want anyone to feel bad.
Right.
But she's my favorite.
Yeah, secretly, we all know.
She is Program Director of the Caritas Center for Christian Formation. She's a licensed clinical professional counselor, author, speaker, retired Moody professor. I'd keep going, but I don't have time. Nancy Kane, welcome back, my friend.
Always a delight to be with you guys.
Now, we have a series we're going to be doing together, but I have to also mention that you and I have a brand new podcast.
We do. We're having fun, aren't we?
Yeah, will you give people a quick synopsis of your brand new podcast?
Yes, well, you and I do it together. It's called Leaving Church, and the reason that I picked that title, or it was suggested to me, is that we're looking at inviting people, whether, there's a lot of people right now that are, especially the millennials, that are deconstructing and leaving church because of their disgruntlement with the church and with Christian culture. And so we're inviting people into considering that the life with Christ and Christ himself can be so engaging and life-giving that they don't have to get stuck into the Christian culture, but see something more and different with who Jesus is.
Yeah. Well said. It's called Leaving Church Podcast. You can get it wherever you get your podcast. We'll talk about that more a little bit later here. But for now, Nancy, we're starting a series. I'm super excited about this. The series is The Spiritual Transformation of the Apostle Peter. So give us kind of an overview of where we're going to go here. So
Peter is one of those characters that in my life as well, people often will identify his awkward moments, or, when he speaks out of turn, or his denial, and then kind of skip to, and then he became a leader in Acts. And I think that for me, maybe this is the way I think, but how did he get there? I mean, how did he go from a bumbling, impulsive, arrogant disciple to then denying and then becoming a leader? And so we're going to look at, over these next 6 weeks, we're going to look at what were the key events in Peter's life, a little bit about Peter today, his background, but then more specifically, what were the key events that occurred for him that the Lord used to shape him, shape his heart, shape his perception of who Jesus is, and then shape his calling so that he could become one of the key apostles for the rise of the early church.
What do we lose if we skip over his foibles and his lessons throughout his journey?
I think we lose the opportunity for us to look at how does God use our own foibles and our own failings. I think a lot of times it's a mystery for us in terms of, I screwed up, and then somehow God's going to make the best of it or change it, but we don't really know the process. And I think that by being able to look at Peter and look at his process, we can get a glimpse as to how God uses our failings and our shortcomings towards our good and his glory.
Well, just as we like to skip over those parts and just cheer for Peter, who he was formed into, I think we like to skip over our own pain, right? No one likes to sit in their pain.
No, and I think for most of us, initially, even before pain is shame, that sense of, I'm less than a human being. I can't face the fact that whatever it might be, that I've screwed up, that I said something embarrassing, that I hurt somebody. That for a lot of us, the initial response is shame and wanting to pull back and not face the shame, and then move on to really owning the pain of what we've done.
So perhaps he's the perfect person to discuss this in Scripture, right? Because we learn so much about him in Scripture.
Yes, exactly. I think that, and for me, I was surprised at once I saw in a sense, stringing the pearls together of the various events in his life, how clear it became of how Jesus was shaping him all along. And I just never saw it so clearly until I put all the sequential events together and then realized what we had in front of us.
Yeah, I guess it's harder with Bartholomew, right, to do that. We don't know as much about what he did.
Right.
Okay, so let's get some of the...
Who is Bartholomew?
I don't even know what he did. And Thomas, he just did a couple things, and they were annoying. So what do you want? Okay,
Thomas is just doubting, right? So
right,
who
that's
knows?
all he did. So let's start off then, as we get into this series on the spiritual transformation of the Apostle Peter. Can you give us some of the background as we begin the journey?
So and a lot of this stuff people would know, but Peter was the brother of Andrew, and they were in a fishing business. They were partners with James and John on the Lake of Galilee. And one of the things that's noteworthy about that is they weren't, so when we think of business, we think of, business suits, office, all that. We're actually looking at rugged, fishing through the night. Fishermen were considered more the coarse, heavy drinkers, heavy partying, that type of lifestyle. And that's the backdrop to which Andrew, Peter, James, and John were living in this business that they were operating. Mary, Jesus' mother, was a sister of Salome, who was the mother of James and John. And so James and John were cousins of Jesus. And what's important to note about that,
I didn't know that, Nancy.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yes.
But also what's important to note about that is that in a tribal community and also in a small town, cousins, uncles, sisters, parents would all be living their day-to-day life together. And so when we think of that then, and Jesus' initial encounters with the disciples, specifically Peter, it's like he just suddenly shows up. He's walking by the scene. He says, "Follow me." And I always saw that in Hollywood movies of Jesus and thought, this seems so bizarre. Like,
right. Like he's a total stranger and he pops in and they're like, "Oh, great, let's go. Come on. I quit."
And also the Hollywood movies often have this kind of surreal look on his face, like he's not exactly in touch with reality, and then he says, "Follow me." Right. And then the disciples conversely have this otherworldly look, and they're just taking off. But what we know now with them being cousins of Jesus, that there would have been a familial, tribal connection. So there would have been a day in and day out familiarity with Jesus, even before the calling. That we don't see in Scripture, but we would have assumed because of the nature of the family system in the Jewish community.
So then it's not such a crazy idea that a couple of fishermen would follow him. They're familiar with him.
Right, as well as they're familiar with him because John also was a disciple of John the Baptist. John the Baptist knew who Jesus was. He would be talking about Jesus. And so, again, there would be this introduction to him before they actually get that call.
Wow, fascinating. We're chatting about the very beginning of a series we're going to be doing once a week on the spiritual transformation of the Apostle Peter. We've talked about his background already, but apparently, I didn't realize this, but you're saying Peter has 3 callings, Nancy.
Yeah, and that's part of that looking more deeply into the Scriptures that was fascinating to me, because you see each gospel writer has his own bent in terms of what he wants to show about Jesus. And so consequently with that, then you have different renderings in terms of different facts and events. But the part that was puzzling to me is that you see Jesus seem to be calling Peter and then calling him again, and then calling him again. And so it's like, is Peter not getting it? Or, what are the Gospels trying to say here? And where I saw, and Charles Spurgeon also talks about this, which I found fascinating, is you have the initial call where Andrew goes to Peter and says, I found the Messiah. He is the one to come. You need to meet him. And that's in John 1:37. And he introduces him to Jesus, and Jesus calls him to be a disciple. He says, "Come, follow me." So the initial stage of, yes, this is what I'm doing. I'm sure they had some kind of conversation. And then Jesus invites Peter to follow him. But then in Luke 5:4-11, you see another, what seems to be a call where they're fishing. And they fished all night, and then Jesus is walking along the shore, and he says, "Drop your nets." And everyone knows the story. Drop your nets along the side of the boat. And Peter resists and says, you just don't understand fishing. We've been doing this for a while, and this is not going to work. And Peter but goes ahead and drops his nets, and then we see the huge catch of fish. But what's telling about this is he drops to his knees in front of Jesus and is convicted by his sin. his lack of belief. And he says, apart from me, I'm a sinful man. And Jesus replies, don't be afraid, for henceforth or coming from here on out, you'll be fishing for people. So now there's a call to a closer relationship. Peter's beginning to understand who Jesus really is. And he is the only disciple in the scriptures that confesses his sin at the calling of Jesus.
Yeah.
Which I think is very, very, go ahead.
Well, I was going to say that when I started listening to the Bible for the first time, 15, 20 years ago, I remember getting to that passage in Luke, and it made me emotional. It's an overwhelming scene where Peter immediately drops to his knees when he realizes who Jesus is. No other disciples that I'm aware of did anything close to that, right?
Right. At least we don't see anything from the testimony of Scripture.
Right.
So I think what the evangelists are trying to say is this is something about Peter's heart that is very, very important. And it's also important in terms of his relationship with Jesus, that his eyes are being open to what the implications are for him to follow such a great rabbi. And he's also saying, apart from me, because I'm sinful, in light of who Jesus is.
What should we take from that? Is that cheering for Peter for his humility, or are we supposed to, glean something from that interaction?
I think that a number of things. I think that the closer we get to Jesus, the more we will see our own sin. And I think this is what was happening as he realized his lack of faith, his lack of belief. Perhaps he recognized his own pride and arrogance in resisting Jesus for the directive of putting the nets on the side of the boat. There's a lot of things that I'm sure he was recognizing that point, to the point that he fell on his knees and was overcome by his own sinfulness. And I think that's a message to us today as well, is how quick are we to recognize our pride, control, lack of belief, lack of faith, and that gazing at Jesus, we see correctly who we are in light of who he is.
Yeah, and he must have already been broken. Like he's clearly still doing his job, and he's discouraged about the lack of fish, but there's a measure at which he's, in his heart, already broken.
Possibly, yeah. What we know is from that point, he's clearly undone.
Yeah.
He's clearly undone by what Jesus has done. And it's also, Jesus does this in what was most important to Peter, making money and catching fish.
Yeah.
And what Jesus says is, you release to me, and I'll show you what I can do.
Yeah, and what do we make of Jesus' initial response to Peter as well, where Peter dropped to his knees, and Jesus responds with compassion?
Yeah, and I think it's so tender that he says, don't be afraid. And I think that he's addressing Peter's, being undone, as well as the anxiety of like, oh my gosh, I don't know what I've got myself into here. I've committed to following you, and now I don't even know what this is all about.
Yeah.
And so Jesus, which is we see so often in Scripture, he sees beyond the words, he sees beyond even the behavior, and he sees right into Peter's soul and says, I know you're afraid. Don't be afraid, because I'm going to be showing you how to fish for people. I've got a plan for you, Peter. Don't worry. I've got this under control.
We've only got about 2 minutes left because I keep asking you follow-up questions, and what you're saying is so amazing.
That's okay.
But let's do the overview of his third call, his call to leadership.
Yeah, this is when, and again, this also always seemed a puzzler to me, but in light of stringing those pearls together of his life, I think it does make sense, is that when we see Jesus renaming Peter, and he says, you will no longer be called Simon, but Peter, or the rock or the stone. And I think this is a call not only to, he's renaming him and saying, this is who I see you to be becoming, and this is who I see you to be in my kingdom. And he's calling out Peter in his leadership. And again, I'm back into a tribal community, and we'll be unpacking this more in weeks to come. But Jesus is very intentional in singling Peter out as the leader of the pack. And as the leader of the disciples, he's giving him a special designation of a name. And that name will be something that Peter's going to be growing into. But before Peter even realizes what he's growing into, Jesus knows and says, "This is who you're going to become. Right now, you're not a rock. Right now, you're shifting sand, but you will become a rock, and you will become a leader for my disciples."
Yeah, that's absolutely beautiful, and it's something we're going to be digging into over the next 6 weeks, as we examine the spiritual transformation of the Apostle Peter with our friend Nancy Kane. So be sure to listen in each week, this half hour. Again, Nancy Kane is a licensed clinical professional counselor. She's program director of the Caritas Center for Christian Formation, a program I'm a part of right now. Nancy, how can folks learn more about what you're doing at the Caritas Center?
They can go to our website, thecaritascenter.com, and they can click on contact for more information.
Yeah, and meanwhile, check out her podcast. I have the privilege of being on it with her. It's called the Leaving Church Podcast. You can find it wherever you get your podcasts. As always, Nancy, thank you so much for your time and your expertise.
It's always a delight.
The preceding audio was originally aired on Moody Radio Cleveland. You can listen live at 103.3 FM in the greater Cleveland area, or download the Moody Radio app and search for Moody Radio Cleveland.